Now, I regret to say that I am probably the speaker who has done the worst job of actually having a talk that is on the topic. But it'll certainly make major connections with other talks. Actually, especially Catherine's talk. Okay, so I'm going to be asking this question, and by the way, that's a picture of joints. Okay, so I'm going to be presupposing this Bergian picture in which you have properties in the world, the perceptual systems detect them, there are iconic representations that involve a singular element picking out an area of space or an object, those are the main possibilities, and a property attributed to them. These are non-conceptual. Concepts come in with thought and reasoning, basic perceptual judgment as a propositional form. Okay, so and this is so. There's on my view. There's always seeing as. All seeing is seeing as, but there's non-conceptual seeing as, and then there's conceptual seeing as. So concepts are constituents of cognitive states. So I'm going to be kind of using that picture, but I think the talk will help to justify that picture as well. Okay, just let me say a little bit about what the difference is between perception and cognition on my view. So I think that perception is constitutively iconic. Cognition is at least in part non-iconic. The reason that cognition can be partly iconic is that it can use you can use perceptual elements in thinking. Now, what is iconic? Well, one way there's no real totally satisfactory account of what iconic means, but one account is if you have a iconic representation that represents a whole, there will be at least some systematic parts that represent part of what the whole represents. So like that little arm part. If you compare that with discursive representations like those in language, England is not part of the Queen of England. Another option is what Roger Shepard called second-order isomorphism. The idea is that there are parts of iconic representations that have certain relations to one another, and they mirror relations in the world. I'm not going to go into this anymore. I'm just sort of saying those things to try to be more specific about what I take the idea to be. Okay, so I think both format and computational role serve to help distinguish perception from cognition. Cognitive representations are roughly inferentially promiscuous. That's Steve Stitch's phrase for substitutable in reasoning, freely substitutable in reasoning. Then there's the famous informational encapsulation and cognitive impenetrability. These things are all highly controversial, but I think they hold in at least rough form. I'm going to say something about the exceptions. Now here, this is a Bergian point that actually Susan alluded to in her talk. The idea is that you only have real predication in propositional representations. The predication in the F in that F serves to determine the referent of that. So it is not a pure predication in that sense. Once you've got something that determines the referent, then you can actually apply a property to it. And then, as I mentioned in Catherine's talk, the perceptual representations are not premises or conclusions in reasoning. They're not reasons. They're not premises or conclusions. They're not parts of inference. They ground premises and inferences. So the view that I'm going to be arguing against is one that has been very much expressed in recent philosophy of mind and cognitive science. So this is Andy Clark in his predictive coding article. The lines between perception and cognition are fuzzy, perhaps even vanishing. And Gary Lupian, I am supporting a collapse of perception and cognition, which makes the whole question of the penetrability of one by the other ill-posed, but I would be thrilled if my arguments contribute to the eventual demise of this question. And even those people who think there is some sort of a distinction often think that a perception can also be a cognition. So this is Rob Goldstone. It just basically says something that entails that. So here's my plan. I am going to introduce the topic in a slightly historical way, and I'm going to introduce this, this new look, and then I'm going to say something about the new look. I'll say a little bit about why to believe in a joint in nature. I'll say this is the sort of trickiest part. To talk about what top-down influences are compatible with a joint. And then I'll say something about core cognition, which will connect to Susan's talk, and she isn't here to correct me, so okay, the new look. Oh, let me say, by the way, that you're going to get entertained in this talk more than in the other talks, because I actually have, like video things that, anyway, here's the first one of them. Okay. Oh, and I won't bother with turning off the lights for this. Okay, so remember what you saw. Try to remember what you saw. Okay, so I'm going to stop this now. So here's the question. You saw a 6. What was that? 6 of what? So what? Let's hear some. What? 6 of hearts, and it was 6 of spades? How many think 6 of hearts? How many think? Okay, it was red 6 of spades, but here's the question. So here's the issue. This is really the issue of the entire talk. Did you really experience that red 6 of spades as the 6 of hearts? Or did you experience the shapes as they were and have a perceptual judgment that it was the 6 of hearts? That's the issue. So was it this, a non-conceptual perceptual representation of that? Or was it a non-conceptual perceptual representation of this with a post-perceptual judgment of that? It's all in the lingo. So the issue here is this post-perceptual lingo. Is it a judgment, or that is a piece of cognition, or is it a perception? Now, as many of you probably know, there was this new look in perception in the 30s and 40s, and many philosophers know this Brunner Postman experiment through Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where it played a big role. So he presented, he did experiments like this, and said, without much argument, that what you were really experiencing that. Okay, and then people realized that there was nothing done to distinguish between perception and perceptual judgment, and that this was a problem. And then methodologies were developed to do those distinctions, and it looked like really people were seeing this, that the perception was of this, and this was a post-perceptual judgment. And this came to the fore in the 60s and the 70s, and then the 80s we had the modularity of mind. And we had Fodor and Plihchin, who made a big deal about illusions, known illusions, as Catherine mentioned, and argued for this idea that perception is cognitively impenetrable to goals, belief, and knowledge. And now we have the new look. In which a lot of the ideas of the new look have been revived, and here are some of the principles. And as with many interesting issues in philosophy of mind, there are both psychologists, neuroscientists, and philosophers on both sides of these issues. So I just, okay. So we have methods for determining whether an effect is perceptual or not, and I'm going to show you one. But I need the lights off. So what I want you to do is to stare at that red dot. Okay, so you need to stare at it. It's going to be about 30 seconds, so it might get a little boring, but don't look away from the red dot. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a display, and I want you to immediately say either right or left, depending on whether the right looks like it might have more or the left looks like it might have more. So I need a right for right side more or a left for left side more, and you need to answer immediately because it's a perceptual phenomenon that disappears if you wait too long. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and I need you to say right or left, depending on which side is more. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. Right. Okay, now if you look carefully at this, you'll see they're actually the same. Okay, if you look, there's a point by point for every point in this. In this one, there's a comparable. They're exactly the same. But the right one looked like more. Why is that? So here's the idea. This is a case of a perceptual adaptation. So in the perceptual systems, there are detectors for various properties, and in this case, it's channels for high and low numerosity. Okay, and when you looked at this thing, you looked at it for 30 seconds, and your channels on the left side for high numerosity are fatigued, and your channels on the right side for low numerosity are fatigued. And the effect is that when you looked at this thing with the same number on both sides, this one you had a preponderance of high channels firing, and this one a preponderance of low channels firing. Okay, so adaptation, perceptual adaptation, is a ubiquitous feature of perceptual systems. It's somewhat less clear that it isn't involved in cognitive systems, but it probably isn't involved in cognitive systems, but there's some room for disagreement about that. So adaptation is one of many tools that can be used to investigate the issue of, and let me go back to this, what properties your visual system, you are attributing that are involved in your visual system and being attributed to objects. So what properties are they? Well, we can test this using methods like adaptation. So this is not some thing to be where there's no way of knowing. Here, I'll just give you another case. This is kind of cool. So I need to look at that. Again, it's a similar thing. Then I'm going to show you something in the middle, and I need you to say either fear or anger, depending on whether it looks, even if it looks slightly more fearful or angry. I need you to say either fearful or angry, depending on whether it looks more fearful or more angry. Okay, I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and you said to say fearful or angry immediately. Okay. Now look at that one. Yeah, okay, now look at this one for 30 seconds too. Okay, so I'm going to show you another one, and you have to say fearful or angry. You ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, fearful, and that's the same one that you said was angry before. Okay, so it's a morph of fearful and angry. The visual system has detectors for fearful and angry, and this fatigue. Fatigue is really a metaphor. What's really happening here is that the thresholds for firing are raised, so you need more of a signal to get the same amount of firing. Okay, so I won't bother to do this, but this is called perceptual adaptation. It is a general feature of perceptual systems, and there's an evolutionary explanation of it, which is that perceptual systems are interested in news. So if something isn't news, when you're looking at it for 30 seconds, it ceases to be news, and then thresholds are raised, and it is a piece of machinery for emphasizing the new. In cognitive systems, old news is something you often need to know, and so there's a rationale as to why cognitive systems might not show adaptation, namely that they're interested in truths, whether they're news or not. Okay, here is another perceptual phenomenon. The red thing here in a sea of green is much easier to detect than the red thing here in things that look similar, and this can be easily tested. If you have, in the case where the distractors are dissimilar, it doesn't really matter much what the number of distractors is. This is the reaction time, and it's pretty much the same reaction time. And this is data for pigeons, so there's probably not a lot of conceptual interference. Here is another example of pop-out. What pops out here? Everybody see the face? Okay, faces pop out. Okay, so in this case, you get converging evidence from a number of different perceptual methods. Here's another completely different thing. This is famous Michotte causality, and this is the Michotte type of demonstration for a non-causal interaction, or at least not the same kind of causal interaction. Now this one is ambiguous, so pay close attention to the very first one because you may not see that interpretation again. So the two interpretations are the green thing launches the red thing, or the green thing passes through and changes color, only one moving thing. So it's either two moving disks or one moving disk that changes color and one stationary disk. How many people have seen both of those? Okay, you might, if you haven't seen both of them, you might try fixing your gaze down here and looking at it in peripheral vision. Does that help anybody? Or, or maybe up there? Okay, I don't know if anyway, look, this is, okay, so here's another perceptual phenomenon. Perceptual individuation, perceptual singling out of an object and tracking. Okay, it's a perceptual phenomenon whether you see something as one moving thing or two moving things. So I've just mentioned three perceptual phenomena that can be used to ascertain what properties are being attributed to something in perception. Now, this may look circular. It may look like I'm defining perception in terms of perception. However, I don't think it is really circular because the idea is you find tests that group together that apply to cases you're sure are perception and don't apply to cases you're sure are cognition. So I'm just trying to fix ideas on the so that we can see how we can see really what it amounts to say that something is perceptual. Okay, so I'm now going to talk about some paradigms of that have been offered cases have been offered as paradigms of cognitive saturation of perception that turn out not to be. So one case that we've talked about, and this is my one implicit case. This is the famous Keith Payne weapons identification. You see a face, a white face or a black face. You see a weapon or a tool, and there's some kind of a mask, and then you have to say, it's somewhat different in different cases, but you have to say whether it's a tool or a gun. And the basic result is you get not a huge effect, but some effect of a false gun for the blackface and a false tool for the with the white face is prime. However, it should be said that when subjects get so this is a speeded presentation. When subjects get a chance to say, "Whoops, I made a mistake," there's really very little, and maybe in fact, no prejudicial effect at all. So that might make you suspect that it's not a real perceptual effect. And here is something that Payne did that suggests very strongly that it's not a real perceptual effect. So well, first of all, you get the biggest effects when the items are hard to see, 65% accuracy. So he had guns and tools, but here's the key thing. He asked the subjects to decide between three options. One is they saw it, they were confident in their answer, and they have perceptual detail. Two is they just knew it was there, but no perceptual detail. And he gave examples of perceptual detail, like the color of the stock or the things like that. Or they just guessed. Okay, and here's the interesting result. The stereotype congruent responses, in other words, the prejudiced responses, all came in here on the no cat, just knew, didn't see any details, suggesting that that the effect was not a genuine perceptual effect. It was on something that you might call, well, I don't know what to call it, but anyway, they said they just knew. Okay, so it suggests its effect on perceptual belief or perceptual judgment, not on perceptual phenomenology. Okay, I'm now going to switch gears to a different case. And this case is one, those of you who are interested in this subject, you might look at the Brian Scholes and Chaz Firestone's website, in which they have a number of debunkings of these cognitive effects on perception studies. So as they say, so here's this famous study by Levin and Banaji that showed that when you matched faces for mean luminance, but where there was a racial difference, the African looking faces were perceived as having different lightness. So as Scholl and Firestone say, it is to our knowledge the only purported top-down effect on perception that readers can experience for themselves simply by looking at the stimuli. And this is a really remarkable thing, because in vision science, the touchstone is you can actually see the effect yourself. But in these cases, these are all, it's all done with statistics, and nobody ever observes the in fact, the odd thing is that many of the effects are so large that you wonder why it is claimed that how can it be that you don't see them given the size of them. So here is what they did. They had an extremely simple method. They just blurred the faces. Okay, so the idea is you blur them and try to make it so that the race isn't visible. But of course, they had to test whether people were cotton on to the idea that that these were derived from faces of different races. So they asked a bunch of, so here's the procedure they used. They asked for a 2-sentence description. If anybody mentioned race or anything similar, they would toss those people. Then they told them they were faces and asked for another 2-sentence description, same thing. If people showed any sign of seeing any race there, they got rid of those subjects. They asked explicitly about race. They said, do you think this experiment might be about race? Have you previously participated in experiments that involve blurry faces? They did all this stuff, and nonetheless, even throwing all those subjects out, substantially more than half counted the left blurry face as darker than, or the right one lighter. So it appears that mean luminance is not enough to ensure the same appearance of lightness. There's something about contours or something even in those faces. So now, as they say, they don't know what the explanation is exactly, but they don't need to know that the experiment is not showing what it's supposed to show, that it's a race effect. So it's something to do with and this is so whatever is going on here, it's within vision. It's not something due to the effect of cognition on vision. And this is a recurrent theme. A lot of what is supposed to be the effect of cognition on vision turns out to be just vision. Anyway, there we go. Okay, here is another. Oh, by the way, you should feel free to ask questions as I go. Yeah.
For me, that actually had a Gestalt switch. It
Oh.
went back and forth constantly between
Oh, yeah?
color, different color.
Oh, okay, interesting. I haven't heard it before, but okay. I can't imagine what could be the. Yeah.
Wouldn't they have primed the subjects by asking directly about race, even if, they said no, then they would have been primed?
Okay, since they're experimental psychologists, I imagine that they ruled that out. Probably, I would guess that they got the judgments first and asked the questions later.
All right.
Or maybe they counterbalanced. I don't know.
No, that would do it. The way you were
Yeah.
telling it, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, these people are crackerjack experimental psychologists. They're not going to make some simple mistake like that. This is the experiment. Okay, so one of the experimental paradigms that has been most prominent in providing supposed evidence for the view that cognition affects perception is Dennis Proffitt's lab, in which, and here's the idea that he puts subjects below a hill, and gives them puts a heavy backpack on them, and tells them they're going to have to go up the hill. Or sometimes he tells them they're going to have to go up the hill, other times not. If they're told they have to go up the hill, then they later give an estimate of the degree of elevation of the hill. It's a bigger, they see that, they report the hill as having a higher angle. And he has many different ways of measuring that. It's not just verbally is one way, but another way is you have a tilt plane. So you get an effect on people's judgment of how steep the hill is. Okay, so Frank Durgan did this interesting experiment, and what he did was he did the gold standard. This is a gold standard of non-replication, which is first you replicate. Okay, so first you show that you can get the same effect. And then you change something and show with that change you don't get the effect. And depending on what that thing is you change, you can completely refute the idea of the original experiment. And here's what he did. He got the effect by doing it the way Proffitt does it. And then he attached a wire from the backpack to the subject's leg, different subjects, and told the subjects that the purpose of the experiment was to measure the activity in the muscles in the leg. And then the effect went away, suggesting this is what's often called an experimenter demand effect. So the idea is that the subjects were somehow cottoning on to what the experimenter wanted. The experiment was interested in their judgments of steepness, and they were cooperatively changing their not that this is conscious or anything, but it was affecting their judgments. These pictures, by the way, so there's my suggested experimenter demand effect. These pictures, by the way, come from Proffitt's rebuttal of Durgan. And the point he's trying to make with these pictures is, I have real hills, and Durgan has these pathetic inclined planes. However, to my mind, this actually works against him, because what it shows is that it's a very robust effect. You don't need a real hill. You can get the result with an inclined plane. So in any case, there's a lot of back and forth. But I should say everything I'm saying is highly controversial, and there's two sides of all this, but I'm just telling you my take on it. And what I'm doing is I'm doing a kind of rough run-through of a number of such studies. This one, in a way, is my favorite. So this is a work in Carl Gegenfertner's lab, and he's done some just fantastic work. And again, I'm giving you my summary. If you go and read these papers, he doesn't really want to draw much in the way of conclusions, but it seems to me there's really only one conclusion from his work, and I will explain that. And I'm just going to give you a really fast presentation of one part of it. Okay, so the method he's used in quite a few studies is this great method of you take common objects and you give them to people in random colors. And you have an apparatus at which they can use to adjust the color, and their task is to adjust it to look neutral gray. Everybody understand the task? So they take a banana and they're supposed to make it look gray. And what happens is, you can see this is the blue part of the spectrum, that when they make a banana neutral gray, they're actually making it extremely blue. Okay? So, and what's the explanation for this is, well, gosh, it sure looks like they have this expectation that the banana is yellow, and it produces a kind of yellow look, and you need blue to counteract that yellow look. So it really looks like a serious effect of cognition on perception. However, things aren't exactly as they seem. So here is an interesting display. This is a bunch of common objects that he used. And here are the objects for which there was a large, this is called memory color, a large memory color effect. Oh, there's the blue Smurf, this blue sign, there's this blue thing, this blue Nivea, yellow thing here, yellow box. But wait, we don't have this, there's no, the red and green things just seem to be left out. And in fact, that's the result. It only works for blue and yellow. For red and green, there's a little or even a negative effect where, like for a red thing, you need more red to make it look gray. So what's going on here? Well, okay, so it's a complicated story, but it looks like, and this is supported by other experiments by the same lab, it looks like it's an effect within the visual system. And that is that for various reasons, there are associations of color within the visual system that are causing the effect, and that for some various reasons they work better for blue and yellow. If it were a general cognitive effect, it would work equally well for all colors, but it doesn't. So again, it looks like something. This has actually been, Fiona McPherson wrote an article about these color phenomena, and the color phenomena are a phenomena that have long been thought to provide the best examples of effects of cognition on perception. And I think the upshot of Gegenfertner is that it's not true. Okay, I'm going to have a very brief run through about how perceptual systems have their own logic. This is something I got from Britt Brogard. This is kind of a cute thing. So you'd expect if just general mechanisms of expectation were at work, that these would all look like octagons, but I take it that doesn't look like an obscured octagon, does it? Right? Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is, I like to call this the peculiarity principle. Perceptual systems are just very strange. They're developed for, according to certain evolutionary demands, and they work they do not work in a way that that has its rationality on its face. Here's I'm just going to say very little about this, but this is the size-weight illusion. So interestingly, for things of equal weight, so this is a demo that these two things are of equal weight, the smaller feels heavier, okay? So this is a well-observed thing, and here's the thing, it's an anti-Bayesian phenomenon. The one that you expect to be lighter feels heavier. So it was once thought to be due to the idea that when your expectations differ, if you expect that thing to be very light and then your hand moves, sort of pushes up on it, but actually that's not the explanation, because it works on if your hand is supported on a surface and doesn't move at all, it still works just the same. Now, there are some wonderful, oh look, I thought I got rid of this slide, but I didn't. Okay, so I'll show it to you. This is a combination of size weight illusion and the materials weight illusion. You've got things of two different materials and two different sizes, and you ask people for their expectations, and they expect the bigger metal cubes. This is size and expected weight. So this is high density, low density. High density is the metal ones. They expect the bigger ones to be heavier. So there was a prior expectation of weight. They lifted them in pseudo-random order, made perceptual judgments, and the upshot is that the materials didn't have any effect at all. So as this is Mel Goodale, he says, their illusions did not reflect their conscious expectations of heaviness. Instead, subjects experienced a size-weight illusion of the same magnitude regardless of the material, suggesting that that it's not just a general effect of expectations. Again, peculiarity. Now, you might think, whoa, why do we think that the expectations are conscious? But look, if they're part of the visual system, rather than being part of a central cognitive system, that supports the joint because it's a within module effect. And often these top-down, so-called top-down effects are top-down, but they're within perceptual modules. Okay, now what is a joint? Okay, let me say first of all, I don't know, nobody knows. But let me just say a little bit anyway. So here is a cross-section of animal and plant cells. I take it that there's intuitively a joint between animals and plants. And here are some features of animal cells and plant cells. And if you look at these, many of them don't seem to be really that fundamental. There are some, there are differences. I mean, there's some differences that are really big thing, like chloroplasts. Oh, what does that mean? I don't understand. Now I'm a little confused because does that say there are chloroplasts in animal cells?
No, animals don't have chloroplasts.
But why does it say? Okay, so that's animal cells.
Yeah.
What? What?
It says animal cells don't have
Oh, don't have. Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't see that line. Okay, so animal cells don't have chloroplasts, and they don't have cell walls, but plant cells do. So I present this because here's there's a recent article by Nick Shea where he says this. I'll read it out to you. An even greater challenge is presented by systems that are input-driven but have an amodal phenomenology. An example is the capacity to represent one's own spatial location. People and other animals represent the relative locations of various features of the environment and their own location within that map. That capacity probably depends on, in part on an evolutionarily ancient system that is shared at least with rodents, dependent in part on the firing of place cells in the hippocampus, which stores map-like information, blah, blah, blah. The system is genuinely amodal in that it takes as input whatever kinds of sensory information are relevant in the current circumstances. And he argues that this is one of many arguments that he gives, that there is no joint in nature. But the thing is, a joint does allow for some cases that mix the two things together, that are in neither side of the joint. And here is a creature that is in that way intermediate between animals and plants. It hunts, it eats plants. Once it eats a plant, it uses the chloroplasts until it digests them. It uses them to generate energy like a plant, and then finally it uses them up and then looks for more. So it has some animal, some plant features. So I think there can be things that are in between. You know, it's a good question as to just how much tolerance there is in a joint, but I don't think the existence of amodal systems of the sort that he talks about, I think these are actually part of perceptual systems. All the spatial perceptual senses have an amodal representation of space or multimodal representation of space. And okay, anyway, there it is. So here is the more significant issues. What top-down influences are compatible with a joint? First of all, diachronic effects, I think, are compatible with a joint. So that is over time. So the claim is that there's a joint between perception and cognition, and that certainly allows for perceptual learning. So like, for example, the learning of language, learning to perceive language. And this point was actually made by Jerry Fodor in one of the very first articles on this. And let me find that Fodor quote. So here's what Fodor says. So he talked about this both in the modularity of mind and in another. This is from a different paper. And you know, the main idea is that well, he says there's no educational program that would dispel the apparent motion of the sun. I don't know why he picks that as an example, since it doesn't really. I'm not sure there's any perceptual, but anyway, there it is. So the main thing is that they're strictly defined limits. So yeah. Anyway, so that's the point. Then there are attentional effects. I'm not going to go into those. I'll skip also perceptual hysteresis, which is an interesting, the stickiness of perception. That's itself quite an interesting thing. In the case of ambiguous stimuli, one possibility for at least many ambiguous stimuli is that there may be two bottom-up processes that and the disambiguation selects between them. So if you attend to one place instead of another, I think the cases that are the best cases for there not being a joint are cases of ambiguous stimuli. However, they may be susceptible to this kind of treatment. Imagery is a really interesting case. So let me show you one of the coolest imagery experiments. So this is a technique due to Vincent DeLollo. And the idea of it is if you see a matrix with a missing dot, you can move your cursor to that spot. Now, if you see first a partial grid of dots, and then in the same place you see another, that disappears, and then there's another partial grid on the very same spot. Of course, if this interstimulus interval is small enough, you can fuse them. But even if you can't fuse them, you can still imagistically superimpose this one on this one and see the missing dot. And here is an experiment on, so do you understand the idea? First you see this, and then that disappears, and then in the very same spot you see this, and they together form something like this, right? Everybody get that? Okay, so here is an experiment, Brockmo, Wang, and Irwin, in which they did this. So, and this is a percent dots remembered. This line is so something is, a percept is on the screen, okay? So if you made a mistake if you put the cursor on one of the dots that's on the screen, then you get less than 100%. So people did actually make a few mistakes like that, more towards the end of 5 seconds of the thing. Okay, so people sometimes made mistakes, but that was pretty close to 100%. The more interesting thing is, what about the mistakes on the imagined grid, that is the one that they were superimposing on the one on the screen? And the answer is that after some time has passed, they are, in the 90% accurate on that, which is an amazing thing, right? You wouldn't maybe have thought that people could do this, but in fact, people can do it. And here's the thing. The first grid is they're told to remember, to project. The grid appears, it goes away, you're told to project, to form an image of that and project it on the one that's on the screen. You make a composite percept of an image and something on the screen, and you can pinpoint the missing dot pretty well, up to 5 seconds. Now, this is an interesting case for the joint between perception and cognition, because you could reason, my God, if I'm just seeing what I imagine, then what good is perception? So this looks like it might interfere with the epistemic purposes of perception. But here's this interesting fact about it, is that it takes about between a second and a half to generate an image. So if you look at this graph, so people are initially right after that thing has if the first grid is just like immediately after the second grid, then they're pretty good at it. But once it gets up to a couple hundred milliseconds, they fall to chance, and then as they generate the image, they get better and better, up to about maybe a second and a half, or between a second and a half, which, by the way, is the time that Stephen Kosslyn has independently calculated it takes to generate a mental image. So it looks like there is not a problem here for a joint or an epistemic problem, because maybe you can generate images of what you expect or want to see, but it takes 1.5 seconds. So anyway, let me now move to core cognition. Okay, so Susan Carey and Elizabeth Spelke have come up with this idea of core cognition that you saw, and the domains of core cognition involve physical objects and their causal interactions, agents, number, and according to Spelke, maybe geometry, and maybe social groups and social relations. And here is Nick Shea on this. Susan Carey has emphasized another set of examples, which she calls systems of core cognition. These systems are intermediate between the paradigmatically perceptual and the paradigmatically cognitive. Two of her flagship cases concern numerosity. Carey, 2009, marshals an impressive array of evidence for the existence of two different relatively low-level systems that are involved in representing quantities. Carey argues that these processes deserve their own category in the psychological inventory. They are neither clearly perceptual nor clearly cognitive. Now that really would be a problem for a joint in nature if there was this major category of mind that was a third category that wasn't either, and that plays such a huge role as this core cognition does. So here are the properties that in some publications Susan lists of core cognition: domain-specific, innate perceptual analyzers, innate conceptual role, continuous through development, long evolutionary history, shared with other primates, and conceptual content. Well, some of these sound kind of perceptual, and others sound conceptual because they contain the word conceptual. So it does look like maybe this is that third category. However, I don't think so. So here's the thing. This is one of the reasons I presented this approximate numerosity. Approximate numerosity can be perceived, as you saw earlier, but it can also be used in thought. You simply form concepts of those numerosities and use them in thought. And the same is true of any perception. For example, color. You can form percepts of color, and then you can form a concept, and color has dedicated perceptual analyzers, and you can reason with those concepts. Now, there is a clear difference, which is that in the case of color, there's no automatic conceptualization. But automatic conceptualization doesn't impugn the distinction between perception and cognition. So here's the way I see it. We have color cognition, we have numerosity cognition, In both cases, we have a perceptual iconic representation. In this case, iconic representation of lots of dots, and this one of red. This one is, they're both non-conceptual, but then you can also have perceptual judgments in which you conceptualize that percept and use it in reasoning. So the idea is that they both have non-conceptual representations that are conceptualized and used in thought. And of course, there is this difference, this culture-specific conceptual role in color, whereas numerosity cases are automatically conceptualized and have a partly innately determined conceptual role. But there's really no real threat to a joint here. So here's a case that I think is plausibly cognitive. I don't really have any data to back this up, but if you're given two colors and asked to choose the one that fits best in between, yeah, that looks like, so, okay. Often you can have problems with colors on PowerPoint, but it sure looks like this one goes in between and these two don't. And here's a similar problem with numerosities. So, I don't know, which one do you think goes in between? Top one, yep. I gave you a hint because it's the same one as top as before. Okay, so, seems like you can conceptualize them and answer that question. So what I think is that if core cognition is really cognition, it goes here. But, I don't know, maybe core cognition is really perceptual, in which case it goes here. So here's an example that Susan thinks is perceptual. So in foraging, birds form some kind of numerosity representation of where the food is, that is more here or less here. But they also form a numerosity perceptions of where the other birds are. Because like foraging, you not only have to think about where the food is, but you also have to think about who else is competing for that food. So Susan thinks this may be done with the visual system. That is, she has evidence that that a lot can be done by perception, including various arithmetical relations. And so the idea is that, if birds are conscious, it looks to the bird as if this location is better. So the idea is it will look a certain way, like look like more food or something like that. So if that's the answer, then that's also compatible with a joint. So, and if core cognition is like that, then core cognition is badly named. It should really be called something else, not cognition. So maybe there's some cases that go one way and some cases that go the other way. But in either case, I don't really think it's a problem for the joint. Now, there are some really interesting issues here, like what is conceptualization? And in particular, does conceptualization require a change in format as well as a change in functional role? And I don't know the answers to those questions, but if somebody knows, I would like to know. Eric knows. Okay, good. Okay, so then finally, is there a joint in nature? Yes. Now, I feel the need to end with this slide. Okay, so I am often asked,
At this workshop?
not in this workshop, but I am often asked for whatever talk I give, I'm asked, why is this philosophy? Or even worse, people don't ask, but they're thinking that. So I have to say something by way of answer because I think it is philosophy. So let me just say a little bit about why I think it's philosophy. So I think it's philosophy of mind, and pretty obviously, perception and cognition are basic features of the mind, what the difference is, whether there's no difference, whether there's a joint in nature. I just think it's obviously of interest to philosophy of mind. If a philosopher of mind is not interested in that question, he's brain dead, if you ask me. Okay, so I also think that it's important to the study of language because a lot of the issues to do with where the border is between cognition and perception have to do with the role of language. Susan gave some number of cases where it looks like certain kinds of cognition are, just they're really part of learning the language is what teaches you that cognition, and language is one system that is really very distinct from perception, and so I think that the borders, the issues to do with philosophy of language and mind, it's important to that. What about, so philosophy of philosophy, Williamson's term. So we should be interested in how conceptual and empirical issues interleave, and this is kind of a paradigm case of that. So I think it's of interest to philosophy of philosophy. And of course, epistemology, Susanna Siegel's work has shown these issues of top-down effects really have big epistemological consequences. And that's the end.